journey begins just east of the town of Weymouth. We'll head down Dorset's Jurassic coast, encountering some of England's most spectacular geological features along the way. From the abandoned ghost town of Tyneham, a detour inland takes us to William the Conqueror's Corfe Castle. Moving on to the towns of Sandbanks and Bournemouth in Poole Harbour, we'll then have a chance to marvel at the ancient pagan holy grounds of Knowlton Rings. From there, we'll continue to the mouth of the River Test and explore the massive Southampton port. From her docks, we'll hop across the sea to the Isle of Wight, discovering the dramatic Needles Battery on the Isle's west coast. Then, to the north, we'll end our journey at Osborne House, once the country retreat of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. We start our journey just outside Weymouth, gateway town to Dorset's incredible Jurassic coast. It spans 153 kilometres of England's southern shore. 180 million years of geological history can be found within the dramatic landslips and eroded coastline, making this area a gathering place for geologists and tourists alike. Perhaps the most spectacular, and certainly the most visited of these geological features, is Durdle Door, with over 200,000 visitors a year. The feature is estimated to be about 140 million years old. Its name, Durdle, derives from the Old English word thurl, meaning to drill. And this is a perfect description of how this arch was formed. The powerful sea gradually eroded the soft clay on both sides and through the centre of the strong limestone arch that remains standing. A fossilised forest on the top makes this a true jewel for geologists. A few bays over, we come to Lulworth Cove. Its unique shape is again a result of thousands of years of weathering. The weak rock at the opening gave way to an onslaught of waves around 10,000 years ago. Then, as the water continued to force its way through the small opening, the incoming waves were diffracted outwards, eroding the sides of the cove more vigorously than the back. Also, the back wall is composed of a 250-metre-long band of chalk pressed into the cliff face, which resists erosion far better than the clay and sands on the side. With 500,000 visitors per year, the cove's spectacular shelter is a draw for swimmers and boaters alike. Some literary circles believe that J.M. Barrie's inspiration for Peter Pan resulted from the author's encounter with a boy named Peter wandering around Lulworth Cove. The boy's father had just died, and he used to play in this area as if it was his own magical world. J.M. Barrie soon married the boy's mother and spent much time strolling with the child through his own personal Neverland. Further down the shore, we come to Warbarrow Bay. The Jurassic coast is not only a sanctuary for tourists, a mecca for geologists, and a source of livelihood for farmers, but is also a central training ground for the British Army. As a result, this particular bay is open only on weekends and at night, due to its use as a firing range and training ground. The beautiful, seldom visited and secluded waters here lure in divers, fishers and scallopers. Flowers Barrow Ridge towers over the shoreline. It is features like this, where millions of years of geological activity are exposed, that make the Jurassic coast famous. But due to constant coastal erosion, this whole cliff face will eventually fall into the sea. Set back is the abandoned village of Tyneham. As the British Army was preparing for the D-Day invasion of Nazi-occupied France, this area was used as a military training ground. With the constant use of heavy artillery and tanks, the small town eventually got in the army's way. So, in 1943, the 225 residents of Tyneham each received a personalised eviction notice, informing them that the land would be taken for the good of the country. An inscription on the church door of the town reads, "We have given up our homes, where many of us have lived for generations, to help win the war and to keep men free. We shall return one day." 77 years have gone by and still nobody has returned, and the army still occupies the land. There were protests after World War II in an effort to repopulate the town with its former residents. But a public inquiry ended the matter when the military formally purchased the land. As the army's presence was a boon to the local economy, nearby settlements went along with the decision. Today, the abandoned village is open for visitors to explore the ruins of derelict buildings and decaying tanks from the Second World War. Overgrown with shrubs and ivy, Tyneham is a fascinating but melancholy reminder of the places that peacetime forgot. Moving inland from the coast, we arrive at Corfe Castle, built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. In a time when most castles were built of earth and timber, this stone structure was formidable indeed. Over the centuries, many other kings continued fortifying the castle until it was finally sold to John Banks in 1635. But when the English Civil War broke out a few years later, Corfe was stormed by parliamentary forces. Because John Banks was in Oxford with the king during the raid, his wife Mary took full control and was able to defend the castle against a force of 500. During the 2-week siege, 100 parliamentarians died and only 2 defenders. For 2 years, it remained the last royalist stronghold in England until it was finally taken and demolished. It has since been bequeathed to the state by the Banks family and is now owned by the National Trust. It remains one of the country's most visited historic sites. The sea on the southern coast of England is notoriously brutal. Here we can see a motorboat struggling in the rough waves, fighting to make it into Poole Harbour. This once massive valley was drowned by rising seas and melting glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. Once used as an invasion point for the Romans during their conquest of England, the estuary now serves as a sheltered harbour with some interesting settlements. This small peninsula, sitting just inside Poole Harbour, is known as Sandbanks. It may seem like a quaint settlement, but in fact this small patch of land has the 4th largest property value in the world, dubbed by some as England's Palm Beach. It has the highest concentration of expensive properties outside of London. Even modest bungalows in states of complete disrepair go for nearly $5 million. It all might seem a bit extravagant, but the beach here is considered to be the most beautiful in all of England. But is it worth that much? On the coast east of Poole Harbour is the town of Bournemouth. Now a popular retirement area, its notable former residents include J.R.R. Tolkien, who used to vacation and write his novels here for over 30 years. Robert Louis Stevenson was also a resident and is said to have written both Kidnapped and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde while living in the town. Again, moving inland, we come to Kingston Lacy. Once Corfe Castle was destroyed in the Civil War, this became the official seat of the Banks family. The house was altered and remodelled in 1835. It was then that the 4 chimneys you can see here were constructed, and stones were also added to the structure at this time, covering up the old brick walls. Kingston Lacy was passed through the family until Sir Ralph Banks finally bequeathed the house to the National Trust. Inside the building are ancient world artefacts collected by the Banks family on their overseas travels. On the outside are Japanese gardens and extensive woodlands. Also recently added are communal growing spaces for nearby townfolk to come and learn how to garden and grow food. This mystical arrangement, known as the Knowlton Rings, is a confluence of old pagan beliefs and Christianity. The circular ramparts were constructed around 2500 BC and are believed to have been a small section of a much larger ceremonial and sacred landscape. This Norman church in the centre was built in the 12th century. Many historians believe the stones in the henge were broken up to construct the church. The village of Knowlton once surrounded the rings until the Black Death in 1485 forced the inhabitants to leave their homes. However, because the church was a prestigious landmark, people continued to come here until 1747, when the roof of the building caved in and the church was finally abandoned. As we continue eastward, we meet up again with the ocean and the massive Southampton port. The second biggest port in Britain after Felixstowe, it is the first point of call for vessels arriving from Asia. A unique tidal phenomenon known by the locals as double tides results in 17 hours of rising tides, meaning the port is accessible by large ships most of the time. Along with the fact that the harbour has complete shelter behind the Isle of Wight, it is understandable why it has had a successful history and is affectionately called the gateway to the world. Once the railway started operating throughout England in the 1840s, the port flourished into the major trading, military and transport post it is today. In the 1930s, Southampton handled over half of England's international passenger traffic and almost 60% of all cargo. And situated here are 5 massive terminals with facilities to handle almost any type of freight. The 40-mile River Test terminates at the docks of Southampton Port. The river mouth has the distinct advantage of being consistently calm and wide, allowing a constant flow of ship traffic. From medieval times to the present day, it has been an important harbour for trade and war. It was an entrance for Viking invaders, and then became a major shipbuilding area for the English fleet in the 100 Years' War. The docks are renowned in more modern history for being the place where the first seaplanes and hovercrafts were developed. And pulling into the docks, we now see the Queen Mary 2. Further west along the coast is the historic monument of Hurst Castle. After Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon in the mid-1500s, England was politically isolated. With threats from France and Spain, he constructed a string of device forts along the coast, and this central section of Hurst Castle still stands as a fine example. Designed with Italian-style fortifications, blockhouses and artillery towers, the fortress was very advanced for the time. And it continued to be used for centuries after. The complex was expanded and refitted for the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, as well as the First and Second World Wars. And just over the water from Hurst Castle is a rock formation known as the Needles, perhaps the most hazardous point for any ship entering the Solent. They were named after a long-gone fourth structure called Lot's Wife that resembled a needle rising out of the ocean. It collapsed around 200 years ago, but the name stuck. The formation is made of chalk that has gone through the geological process of folding, when layers of minerals are piled and compressed over thousands of years to form durable rock. These jagged chalk structures don't terminate at the lighthouse, but actually continue far out to sea, hidden underneath the waves, and have historically been incredibly dangerous for seafarers. After many shipwrecks on these rocks, merchants petitioned the government for a lighthouse in 1782. But the original lighthouse that was built was too high and too far inland to be useful, as it was constantly shrouded by fog and mist. Finally, the lighthouse we see today at the end of the rocks was constructed in 1859. It ran on a generator with a single keeper tending it until 1994, when it was fully automated and fitted with a helicopter pad. And built behind the Needles lighthouse on the Isle of Wight is the Needles Battery. The complex was originally constructed in the 1860s to defend against a potential invasion from France. When it was discovered that the pounding effect of gun and cannon fire was causing the cliff to crumble, the battery was reconstructed higher up the cliff. The old and new batteries were rearmed with modern equipment and served as protection in both World War I and II. Combat took place very close to the battery, with German U-boats sinking 2 British ships right off the shores below. At the northern end of the Isle of Wight is Cowes. This town of about 10,000 sees its population double every summer at its famous regatta. This event is a yachting tradition that dates back to the early 1800s, when King George IV granted funds to the boating spectacle. Supported by royalty ever since, the regatta has become the largest in the world, and the town's resident Royal Yacht Squadron has become a prestigious name in international boating. Starting as a mere cluster of fishermen's shacks around defensive forts, Cowes has come a long way and established itself as one of the major yachting capitals of the world. And our last stop is just across a small inlet from Cowes at Osborne House. Queen Victoria visited the Isle of Wight a number of times in her childhood and said of the area, "It's impossible to find a prettier spot." So it is no wonder that in 1853 she had a summer retreat built here for herself and her husband, Prince Albert. The two were nature and garden enthusiasts, and so took plenty of inspiration from the gardens of Europe when planning the landscape. Italian-influenced terraces and miniature buildings are especially noticeable. The house itself was designed by Prince Albert in conjunction with Thomas Cubitt, the same architect who created much of Belgravia in central London. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, Osborne was given to the state. Many of the rooms were reserved as a museum to the Queen, while the rest served as a naval academy. But now, the entire complex is open to the public and in the care of English heritage. Some houses in the grounds are even available for rent. In fact, the fame of the building was so widespread in the 1800s that in 1876, the colony of Victoria in Australia modelled its first government house after this design. Even today, the beauty and heritage of Osborne House and England's southern coast is renowned around the world. A perfect place to end this journey.